Hello again. The first lecture of this course is dedicated to the Council of the Russian Church that took place in 1917 and 1918. We remember from your Russian history class about the First World War that lasted from 1914 until 1918. And during that war, Russia suffered a crisis, and as a result of this crisis, there was a revolution in February, exactly 100 years ago. And the Tsar abdicated for himself and his son, and in order that provisional government would lead the country to to referendum that's supposed to decide what kind of government would lead Russia further. So this, as you remember, this referendum has never taken place, but in this time, in February of 1917, a huge, very profound change took place in the Russian Church, because since Peter the Great, the Russian monarch was the head of the Russian Church. It was not officially proclaimed so until Emperor Paul. And Emperor Paul officially introduced this into laws of the Russian Empire. So now the Russian Church kind of was beheaded, because all promotions of bishop nominations were done in the name of the Russian monarch. So since monarch stepped down, the whole question was how the Russian Church is going to proceed. No council took place during 200 years of the synodal system. And the synodal system, as you remember, was from 1721 until 1917. So the church was governed by a monarch through his chief officer. At this time, to some degree, synods, they represent conciliar principle in the church. But synodal structure, where bishops would go to St. Petersburg and take part in discussing church issues, was not really similar, was not the same as a fully conciliar structure when bishops meet, all bishops of the church meet in the framework of councils and freely discuss all issues that they consider pressing. So in this case, the major interest was of the imperial power during the synodal period. So now this imperial power disappeared, and new synod was elected in March of 17, and members of that new synod, new members of the synod were bishops who were not supported by the old regime. So mostly those bishops who were mostly supportive to the royal family, they had to step down. So, and a new thing in the Russian Church at this time took place when dioceses started to select or elect new bishops. So there were elections in dioceses where Christians elected a number of new ruling hierarchs. And I should say that those choices that Christians made, they were good choices. Like in Moscow, Archbishop Tikhon, future patriarch, was elected. In Kharkov, in Vladimir, there was Metropolitan Sergei, and in Kharkov there was Archbishop Antony. And in St. Petersburg there was Metropolitan Benjamin. So mostly those choices, they were good choices. All choices, I should probably say that they were good choices. And that was something new that never happened before in the Russian church. It's canonically problematic, but nevertheless it was an interesting experience. So, and with this new regime in country, with new provisional government, that was a temporary government, everyone was talking about liberalization of society, about new freedoms, and this spirit also did not leave church alone. And church, in person of her bishops, also started to talk about necessity to have a council. And this council was very unusual for the Russian church because it was a purely church event that was not in any way connected with the civil authorities. So that's how it was different. And this council was finally organized in Moscow and was solemnly opened on August 15, old style, on the day of the feast of Dormition of the Mother of God in Moscow. So the church was very excited about this, and church also, many representatives of the church supported changes in Russia, supported changes with provisional government. Basically, it was already pre-decided that Russia was going to be a republic, and there were very few people who would continue to support old form of the regime, monarchy, and it only was question what kind of republic in Russia going to happen. But as you know, this referendum was never able to complete its work, and because it was dispersed by the Bolsheviks in January of 1918. And along those lines, the church council proceeded. So initially, the whole question about restoration of the Patriarchate was a challenging question, because the synodal structure was already known for almost 200 years, and some people would argue that basically that would be a step back to reintroduce Patriarchate. So kind of they believe that maybe synodal structure was exactly what the spiritual statute argued for, that it was a collegial body and therefore it was superior to a singular source of authority in the person of a patriarch. So there were discussions, and the Bolsheviks a successful attempt to take over power in both capitals, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, intensifies those discussions, because people started to think now we don't really have a reputable representing figure, and without such a figure we need to have some figurehead, and this figurehead they believe was the person of the Russian Patriarch. Okay, so that's something that we need to keep in mind. This council is officially known. This council is officially known as local council of the Russian Church, and the council was composed from 4 metropolitans, 21 archbishops, 43 bishops. There were 5 representatives from each diocese. There were about 30 representatives of ecclesiastical academies, the Russian Academy of Science, 11 universities, and 10 representatives were on behalf of academic monastics, I mean monks who went to ecclesiastical academy or who were scholarly trained. Also, there were representatives of major Russian monasteries, Lavra, and there also were representative of Единоверцы. I hope you remember what does this term mean. And also there were lay people, but not women. So they represented very well the Russian Church. And when you read minutes of those meetings, you are struck by the level of commitment that people who participate in discussions demonstrated. They were very, very devout people, members of the Russian Church. And I should really sort of go a little bit fast forward and to say that since the same thing that happened to the referendum that's supposed to define the future fate of Russia, the same thing happened also to the Russian Council, because the Bolsheviks, they did not allow the Council to complete its work in 1918. Therefore, many documents, they were left in drafts. Some documents that were adopted, they nevertheless were never used due to very different political climate in Russia that lasted in some degree of brutality until the end of the communist regime. So only now, actually, in the last 10 years in Russia, the acts of this council have been analyzed and have been finally published. Not everything has been published yet, but things are now constantly published with apparatus, with comments, with proper references. So in order that the people in the Russian Church would start to analyze and absorb and perhaps use. And that event that I'm taking place right now in Moscow is also part of this thinking along the line of this council. So it's intercouncilor meeting that now also has not just men but women, representatives of the Russian Church, and it's like a think tank that discussing various documents, and bishops and lay people, they can speak to each other, they can rub shoulders in discussions, which is a really amazing thing. I hope we would have something like that in our Russian Church abroad. But the whole thinking, the whole impulse for this event, for this intercouncilor meeting that exists as an organ of conciliarity within the Russian Church, is coming from this 1917-1918 council that I'm talking to you right now about. So there were various departments. One department was responsible for liturgical issues. Since our Typica is monastic Typica, there were various attempts to adopted better for the use of non-monastics. And some renovationists, just keep remember this word, renovationists, that I use right now for the first time, they employed those projects, those drafts, and unfortunately they compromised by the use of them, those ideas, since the renovationists as a movement, as a Protestant movement in the Russian Church, were very strongly connected with the Bolsheviks, and unfortunately now we cannot. Yes. So also there was Department of Supreme Church Authority, and this department designed a new church authority in the Russian Church, Supreme Church Organization, that was represented by His Holiness Patriarch of Russia once he was reintroduced, by Supreme Ecclesiastical Council that also had some white clergymen, and also the Bishop Council of the Russian, the Synod of the Russian Church. So there were like three executive authorities. So the supreme authority became All Russia Local Council with Bishops' Council, because bishops, they approved all decisions of that council. And during intercouncil periods, there was a synod. The synod was responsible to guide church affairs in the period between bishop councils. Okay, so there also was Department of Church Court and Department of Parish Development. And I should say that in this church, in the Russian Church abroad, we have parish bylaws. And these parish bylaws, they were adopted, like 70% of those parish bylaws, they, in essence, the bylaw adopted in the Russian Church in Russia. But unfortunately, in Russia, they could not use it during the Bolshevik regime. So the bylaws adopted by the All Russia Council became very useful practically. Also, they are disputable by some by many priests because they give a real big degree of authority to parish councils. So, but they were adopted in essence during this All Russia Council. So there also was department of the church existence in the state, so on the relationship between church and state, and there also was department for preaching and for church art. Okay, so hope you see me somehow better. Now it's 4 o'clock here on January 5th. Right, in the first year classroom. Also there was Department of Church Discipline that dealt with canonical sanctions and canon law and the penances prescribed by canon law. Okay, regarding inner mission and external mission. So like internal and external. Internal mission would be mission among the people who are technically Orthodox but who are not church practitioners. And external mission would be for people who were not Orthodox. And also was department for all believers and единоверцы, which I don't really know how to, what kind of term should be, what is the proper term for them in English. They're kind of like our uniats. They used to be treated as a sort of paramount to uniats, so as you remember, people who were on their way to become fully Niconian, but for the sake of convenience, they were permitted for indefinite time to practice all the rituals. So that's how единоверчество was treated in the Russian imperial time. So there was also department of monasteries, and there were at least one monastic conference in the pre-revolutionary Russia, where representatives of all monasteries, they met in Holy Trinity St. Sergius Lavra to discuss pressing issues of monastics. So there was Department of Ecclesiastical Academies and Department of Ecclesiastical Schools. And under the Department of Ecclesiastical Schools, they also meant church parish schools. But already new trends were seen in the fact that the provisional government removed all parish schools from the jurisdiction of the church into the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Education. And Ministry of Education wanted to strip off all parish schools from their ecclesiastical component and turn them into more secular-minded establishments. So there also was a department that studied more successful teaching of law of God in secular schools and regarding church property and status and material status included of clergy. Also on regarding relationship with the Church of Georgia that's claimed back autocephaly that existed from the 5th century in the Georgian Church. So there were a lot of topics and they were discussed in those various departments. It's really important for us to remember, and please make a note of this, that behind election of the Russian Patriarch or re-establishment of the Russian Patriarchate was Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky. Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky, he was very much in favor of restoration of Patriarchate, and that was his point of disagreement with the Russian, with the chief officer of the Russian governing synod, Konstantin Petrovich Pobedonosov. So he was working hard before the revolution on promoting the patriarchal office, on inviting, for instance, in the year of the celebration of the 300th anniversary of the Romanovs, the Patriarch of Antioch, Gregory, who came and pontificate in Moscow's cathedrals, and for the first time the Russians saw beauty and dignity of the patriarchal service. Also, he was known to people in the East, Metropolitan Anthony, because he was a Grecophile. So during the council, he organized a trip to New Jerusalem Monastery, and you remember, of course, this monastery was erected by Patriarch Deacon. And with Patriarch Deacon, it's in most cases either people love him or they dislike him badly. So Metropolitan Anthony, he was a great fan, a great admirer of Patriarch Deacon. So he brought members of the council on this excursion to his grave. And he believes that Patriarch Deacon was really a great figure worthy to be canonized, partially to the fact that he broadened the mindset of the Russian Church by reconnecting the Russian Church with the rest of Orthodox Christendom, particularly with the Greek Orthodox churches. So Metropolitan Anthony was behind this, and no wonder that during the elections he received more candidates than anybody else, than all other candidates. He received 101 votes to support him. Then he was followed by Metropolitan Cyril of Kazan, and you see this Metropolitan's face every day when you go to classes, because his big mugshot portrait is located on stairways leading to this class. So, and then also there was Metropolitan Arseny of Novgorod, who is famous for his book for basic with basic notation for basic church usage, chant usage. And there also was Metropolitan Tikhon of Moscow. So an elder Alexei, I believe his name was, he was asked to pull out a lot. So their names were put in some container, and this holy elder took cards or whatever it was for, and proclaimed the first name that he grabbed, and it was the name of Patriarch Tikhon, of Metropolitan Tikhon of Moscow. So Metropolitan Tikhon of Moscow, he didn't really leave any academic writings. I'm not sure if even his thesis that he wrote in the St. Petersburg Academy was ever published. So he was more pastoral than theologically minded scholar figure. He definitely was not of the same weight class as Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky, who was among representing like the Studite tradition in Russia, so very kind of aggressive, very fanatically monastic, very convinced, very charismatic. So that was Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky, who tutored, ordained generations of future Russian bishops. Metropolitan Tikhon was not on the same scale, but on the other hand, he had very unique experience that Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky was lacking. And that's experience that he was for about 6-7 years a bishop in America. And the whole arrangement of this council with participation of laity was fashioned after regular diocesan meetings, diocesan councils that took place in the American diocese of the Russian Church before the Revolution. So he kind of had this, it was kind of his secret weapons, that he lived in very different surroundings than most of the Russian bishops lived. So he was elected a new patriarch. I also mentioned these various departments, and among them was mentioned the departments that dealt with the relationship between the state and the church. And I should say that from those minutes of the meetings, of the bishops' meetings, you see that basically people didn't really understand what was happening with Russia, because they could not grasp, they could not conceive that the new regime that came to replace the Russian monarchy was totally anti-church, anti-religious. Because what happens that the Marxist theory, which is an economic theory, and as in any academic theory, it can be challenged. It's not an axiom, it's not a dogma, it's just one approach, one possible theory, right? On the Russian soil, this Marxist economic theory was turned into kind of religion. And Bolsheviks, they were sectarians, they were socialist revolutionaries of the most radical kind, and they treated Marxist theory as religion. And therefore we see the similar case as it was, for instance, in the Roman Empire, where the government required loyalty to the state, and Christians could not give this loyalty to the figure of the emperor, who was considered as a semi-deity. So similar things would happen here, because on the Russian grounds, Marxism was turned into some kind of semi-religion, with the cult of the founder of this religion, and with his remains placed on the major square. People go and venerate them. Revolutionaries were treated as saints, and there also was eschatological teaching about future very harmonious life. But not in heaven, but on the earth. So people who would disagree with this were considered as a obsolete, as a retarded element that needed to be either isolated or destroyed. So, and here we see all this aggression against the church that members of the council only started little by little to understand, because throughout the council there were constant news feeds regarding persecution in various parts of Russia against the church, vandalism, hooliganism, various assaults, including murder of church servants. So therefore they were getting in grip with this new reality, but they were still very far away from understanding those Bolsheviks' really agendas, that they didn't want church to exist, and they had to deal with the church because it was the only remnant of the imperial Russia. They could not be disassembled, that could not run away in exile, and that had to survive in new country, because Bolsheviks also realized that they also could not destroy all Orthodox Christianity, they could not eradicate it, so they had to deal with it, they had tried to destroy it gradually. But having said that, I realized that also I did not mention the day of the Bolshevik revolution, when Bolsheviks came into the power. So the Bolsheviks came into the power on October 25th, old style, November 7th, new style, 1917. So they were not in position to disperse or close down the council at this time, because they were still weak enough and they only struggled to take over power from the provisional government. So therefore the council was able to proceed with the election of patriarch and was able to proceed with installation of the patriarch that happened in late November and December the 5th by new style, the entrance on the feast on the entrance into the temple of the Most Holy Mother of God. So it's also I think I should say that the whole rite of intronization or of installment was designed by Archbishop Anastasia of Kishinev, who became the second first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad, and whose remains are here in Jordanville. So they under the sanctuary of the Holy Trinity Cathedral of Jordanville. And Archbishop Anastasia, he is for me the most fascinating first hierarch of the Russian Church abroad. He was known for his insights, for his also understanding, for his sense of things that that escape conventional wisdom in the Russian Church abroad. We will be mentioning him many times in this class. So he designed this rite of installation, and what is peculiar and what escaped many people, that in this rite there was polychronia proclaimed towards the end of this rite. Many years, and many years were proclaimed to the government, and the government was, unless they meant they refused to recognize the Bolshevik government, which I don't think was the case, to this government, to the new Bolshevik government, because it was done in December of 1917, when this government was already fully in control of the post capitals, at least. So Patriarch Tikhon became our first patriarch after the restoration of this institute. And when you go next time to the commencement hall below, please do pay attention to his icon. This icon was painted as a portrait by Archimandrite Cyprian, the famous rock or iconographer. And then, I believe, I may be corrected, but I believe then later, after his canonization by the Russian Church abroad in 1981, a halo was added in the same way as it was done to Blessed Ksenia of St. Petersburg, to this portrait. But you see that on the background, in the lower part of this icon, there are also prison windows. And this is something that sends a message about his reign. His reign was short. He was only the patriarch for less than 8 years. But his reign is comparable with the reign of another metropolitan, another leader of the Russian Church, Metropolitan Philip II, who was the metropolitan during the second period of the Ivan IV, Ivan the Awesome, Ivan the Terrible. And I meant comparable because Metropolitan Philip didn't really do much while he was in charge of the Russian Church, but he became known for his confrontation, for rebuking the Tsar, for his cruelty, for his bloodshed. So in similar comparison can be done with Patriarch Tikhon. He didn't really do very much for developing Russian Church because he was not in position, but he is credited for his ability to navigate in very new, very different circumstances, and to navigate the church through those very difficult circumstances. So Patriarch Tikhon, by the requirement of the council, he appointed a number of successors, and his successors, they were called locum tenens. So this is a Latin word that is reserved in English for this position. So locum, can you see it? Okay. So locum tenens. You cannot see it really, but you will locum tenens. Anyway, so you will come across it, and it's really uncanonical. So canons they prohibit to hierarch to appoint successors. But this is what is called a Christian paradox. So it's prohibited, but nevertheless it's acceptable. Why? Because canons prohibit this for different reasons. They prohibit this because all what is done in the church is done by the Lord Jesus Christ. So the bread and wine are turned into blood and body and blood of Christ by Christ himself. And all liturgical actions also performed, in fact, by Christ. So through hands of a minister. In this sense, bishop cannot really give something that doesn't belong to him, because priesthood, ordinations, they are done by Christ. So he cannot ordain anyone himself. So and he only can do it on behalf of the church with church sanction. And in this case, the church gave this sanction to Patriarch Tikhon in order to preserve succession in the Russian church in such extraordinary circumstances. Okay, so that's important. So during the Christmas break of 2017, bishops went back to their dioceses because they were away from their dioceses for the work of the council for a number of months. So they wanted to come back. And tragically, a number of them could never come back. Like Metropolitan Vladimir, who went to Kiev, was killed in Kiev and martyred, and became the first martyr of the first new martyr of the Russian Church, kind of. At least he was the first bishop martyr of the Russian Church of this new period. Metropolitan Andrei, he also went there, and he could not come back to Moscow because of civil war that broke out in 1918. So he was cut out from Moscow. And most of the members of the synod elected by that council, they also could not come back and participate in the work of the Russian Supreme Authority, because now some of them were killed and some of them found themselves outside of the Red Russia, like Archbishop Anastasi, Metropolitan Platon of Odessa, Metropolitan Anthony of Kiev. They all were members of the Synod, but they just could not participate in this. So therefore, after the end of the Civil War, all those supreme ecclesiastical organs, they were compromised. They could not really act in full capacity, in the capacity envisioned by the councils that founded them. So that's also important to consider. So in order to chastise the persecutors of the Russian Church and fulfilling request of the council, Patriarch Tikhon came up with a text of excommunication, otherwise known as anathema. The text was targeted against those persecutors of the Russian Church who were, at least formally, members of the Russian Church, who were baptized Christians, baptized Orthodox, baptized Christians. And this text was produced on the Theophany of 1918, and it is commonly known as anathema against the Bolsheviks. But if you read the text itself, there are no mention of the Bolsheviks specifically, but there are mentions those who persecute the church, be they, let's say, Ukrainian nationalists, or be they people of various bandits, or various people various vandals who had no political affiliation. All of them were considered excommunicated. The previous attempt, one of the previous attempts undertaken by the council had place in August of 1917, when the council also appealed to all Orthodox Russians to stop attacking on political grounds each other. But unfortunately, this appeal came on deaf ears, because it was already too late, and people didn't really pay much attention to the council. So that's also important. So the next day after this excommunication, the church was separated from the state. And officially in Russia, the Bolsheviks proclaimed the freedom of religions, of freedom of non-believing for non-believers. And that was very officially, it was quite in a fashion of Western European countries. But in fact, agenda was to destroy the church, and this was profoundly different situation than it was in the European countries, because the Russian new Soviet constitution adopted in a few years' time was very progressive and liberal. But in fact, this constitution didn't really have any value, because there weren't democratic checks and balances available in this country to defend this constitution, since there was a single-party system in Russia. So, in January of 1918, the Council of the Russian Church also prescribed to collect materials about all victims of persecution, in order that they be studied and collected. And this is something that the church in Russia could not really do after the triumph of the Bolsheviks, but the Russian church abroad, from the very beginning, from its very foundation, collected those materials, sort of those records, and finally they were reviewed prior to the canonization of the Russian new martyrs in 1918. In July of 1918, the last royal family was brutally killed in Ekaterinburg, in the Urals. And Patriarch Tikhon also appealed to the faithful, where he laminated this crime against the former Russian Tsar. So that's something I really hope that this give you idea about this council. And this council is something that used to connect us with the Russian Church very strongly. I mean, us, the Russian Church abroad. So what do I mean? That we believe that after this council there was period of various irregularities in the Russian Church, and many believed that the Russian Church needed a sequel council that would sort out all what happened after the council in 1917 within the entire Russian Church, and the homeland and the diaspora. So, but such a council never took place, but a number of conciliar measures did take place in the Russian Church, and the Russian Church abroad found them satisfactional, and that's they paved the road to our union or our reconciliation with the Church in Russia. So, therefore, this council was an important marker for the Russian Church abroad for a long time. And also our Pan-Diaspora Council that reviewed the issue about reconciliation in 2006 was directly inspired by the Council of 1917-1918. So I wonder if what kind of similar conciliar institutions exist in your churches. So please discuss it if there is any similar conciliar institutions exist, like the institution I mentioned that fortunately exists now in the Russian Church, which is the interconsular presence, or this council with participation of 1917-1918, with participation of laity and lower clergy. So please talk about this, and thank you very much. I hope it was not too monotonous and I didn't put you asleep. So anyway, I will come after you, we'll talk about this, I will make sure that this, you keep this in mind. Okay, so, and I did, alright, so that takes care of this so far. Okay, so happy new semester of studies, okay? Stay tuned.